In the polite world of New Hampshire politics, you wait your turn. You shake the right hands, raise the right amount of money from the right people, and you never interrupt your elders. But our guest today did not get that memo. In November of 2025, at a unity dinner that was meant to celebrate the Democratic establishment, our guest actually stood up and heckled U.S. Senator Jeanne Shaheen to her face.
Nobody wants to extend the Affordable Care Act tax credits more than me or more than Senator Hassan.
Then why did you vote for it?
He did not do it for fame. He did it, he says, because he felt betrayed. This guest is Heath Howard, a 25-year-old who is a state representative in New Hampshire who earns a salary of $100 a year. Yes, you heard that right. He is running for Congress with a campaign account of modest means, pennies compared to the millions of dollars that have been raised in the war chest of his opponent. And by all traditional metrics, his candidacy is a flick. He is merely being outspent into oblivion. But Heath Howard is running a very different kind of campaign than normal, fueled by a accident that nearly left him paralyzed and a legislative record that defies his own age. Heath Howard is running a campaign of existential confrontation. He argues that a system where only the wealthy can afford to run is a system that is worth breaking. And so hopefully in this interview, we can answer the question of, is Heath Howard part of the future of the progressive left or just a shout in the dark? First, again, thank you, Representative Howard. I really appreciate you for coming on to my show. And we do have a lot of specific ground to cover regarding your record and your tactics. But before we get into that back and forth, I'm going to do with you what I've done with all of my interview subjects so far, which is I want to give you the floor. So for the next 5 minutes, uninterrupted, if you want that long, tell the voters of New Hampshire who are watching, as well as my own audience who maybe don't live in New Hampshire but are interested in this race, exactly who you are and why you believe that you are the necessary choice for New Hampshire's first district.
Yeah, so New Hampshire in our first district, we are actually one of the few open primaries anywhere in the country right now. And so we've got a lot of people hopping in. It's one of, both on the Republican and Democratic side, we've got some pretty crowded primary fields. I think that it's really important that we have young voices stepping up across the board. And, at 25, I'm one of the youngest legislators anywhere in the country. I was able to get elected in a seat that is traditionally Republican leaning. We voted for our Republican governor, our current Republican governor, our previous Republican governor. My hometown voted for Trump. It's been a very difficult thing to get reelected and then reelected. And it's going out to the doors, it's talking to the voters, it's explaining how I approach the issues and really kind of where we can actually come together. Because, I think that people across the board are seeing how politics in both the Republican and Democratic parties have failed them, and that we need a new generation of leadership to step up. I work with, people on both sides of the aisle in the New Hampshire state legislature, and I will say this. It is always a pleasure to work with somebody on the younger side of things rather than anything else, because there are always those common ground pieces where we might not necessarily agree on everything, but there are agreements that are made on what issues are actually happening. Because I think that, especially in the New Hampshire state legislature, we have a situation where we pay our state reps and our state senators $100 a year. It doesn't really allow for the working class people to have a voice. It doesn't really allow for them to expose, what they actually feel, especially when we don't have things like remote testimony, when we don't really have the opinions of people who are taken online as seriously as people who show up in person. And, as somebody who's a member of the disability community, I find that very troubling, especially when we're looking at the federal level, how members of the disability community are underrepresented by far. And there's a real problem with that, because if people run for office, they lose access to their benefits. They lose access to federal benefits that they rely on to survive. And it really limits the type of voices that exist in the halls of power. And that's where, when we see the Trump administration and Republicans, like here in New Hampshire, going after Medicaid, going after Medicare, going after things like SSDI, where people rely on these programs, where we don't have another option, because we need to be healthy in order to work. And we're imposing work requirements on these people. It's so backwards. And that's where we need people from our community to say how it's going to affect us because they're not listening. And that's one of the reasons why I'm stepping up. I'm the first union endorsed candidate in this race. I have the support of the IBEW 104. I'm very, very proud of that, despite what some people might claim. And, it's, I can go into that later. But, it's also the fact that we have the support of over 30 elected officials here in the state. And that's really a testament to the power that we're building. And I'm really proud of the fact that, despite being the youngest one in the field, I'm the one with the most experience as an elected official, which, is a little bit comical, but it is still something where I really am proud of what I've been able to accomplish and what I've been able to do over the past few years.
I want to build on that, because I've looked into your record as a state legislator, and you've definitely had some tangible success, man. I mean, like you passed the blue envelope bill, right, for drivers who have autism, and you sponsored legislation to stop private equity from buying homes. But here's the thing, right? Like I think most people, when they look at Washington, what they see is awful, right? Like I think most
Yeah.
progressives see a House Democratic caucus that is just totally rudderless, has like no direction against Trump at all, and certainly none in an affirmative way to actually get progressive priorities passed. And I think they
Yeah.
see a Senate leadership, right, which is supposed to be the more like senior of the bodies, that is, if not ineffective, like impotent, right, in its direction as well. And knowing what you've been able to do in the New Hampshire State House, and knowing that there are clearly tangible things that you can still improve for the lives of people in New Hampshire. I mean, just as a taking from your own intro, even just trying to pursue maybe like a salary increase. I don't know, maybe a quintupling to $500 a year, something. I,
Yeah.
I guess my question is, given that the most effective resistance and progress seems to be coming from local leadership like you, why leave that body? Why leave that post to go into this maw of nothing? You know?
Yeah. Well, we need people to step up. And the thing is that as I had already mentioned, the New Hampshire state legislature is not exactly something that allows working people to sustain themselves. And that's one of the big reasons why I'm not able to continue doing this. It's a real problem that I think that we do need to address. And how we actually compensate our state legislators needs to be a conversation that we take up. Unfortunately, it's been very difficult to approach that conversation. I think that we have some issues related to the constitutionality of it, where we have that $200 placed right in our constitution. It limits the type of discussions that happen, unfortunately. And I think that that's something that does need to be fixed. But we also, as you have mentioned, seen the ineffectual leadership that's been taking place in Washington. And that's where I think that we need people who have that proven record to step up, who have shown that they can actually achieve success. And I think that, when we look at the issues that people need us to talk about, that's what my campaign's all focused about. And that's where I think that we're meeting people where they are and are addressing the issues that they are asking our elected officials to talk about and come up with solutions for. And that I think is really why I am drawn to run for the U.S. Congress.
I can appreciate that answer. I really can, and it mirrors a lot of what I hear from other people who have had on my show. But the one thing that I keep coming across is this sense of purpose and this sense of idealism, which I think is necessary. I think optimism is the most important thing for us to hold on to right now. But you're 25, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes, and I'm 27, and I remember, it was only 7.5 years ago now. So when you were, I guess, 18, and when I was 20, I remember when the squad came into Congress, and they had very high hopes. They were certainly riding the sort of tail end of like Bernie's initial populism becoming more of a popular sort of political ideology. But I think you and I both watched as they really struggled to pass like landmark legislation, and certainly they changed the timbre of the conversation. But you are running on that platform, right? Of like generational leadership, bold structural change, um, and without the kind of networks of support that your opponents currently have, even, and facing those same institutional walls that all the members of the squad faced and all of their acolytes as well. I have to ask you the same thing I've asked every other person I've had on the show, which is like, why should voters believe you that you will be able to actually be like more effective in moving that needle than the progressives who have come before you?
Yeah, it's because I have an actual record of doing it. And it's something where I think that, that is really important because the New Hampshire state legislature, it's 400 members. It's the largest state legislature anywhere in the country. And, it's very comparable to the 435 members that are in the US House of Representatives. Yeah, there are people who have their own interests. There are things where you're going to have different factions that form, and you have to figure out how you can navigate where you can find those votes. And finding those votes is just as difficult in the New Hampshire state legislature as it is in Washington. Maybe it's a little bit more difficult in Washington. But don't get me wrong. It's, one of those things where we do kind of have to come in with that naivety, where we have to find those cracks, where we have to figure out where we can place pressure and where we can get things done. Because going into the situation that we have in Washington and assuming that things will be the same is insanity in a lot of ways. And going through a lot of what we are seeing, we need real change. And that means going to the table with something new, going to the table with new ideas, with new proposals, with new people, and having conversations with different groups and different stakeholders that are actually going to make that change possible. Because we are going to have to focus on where we can build those different coalitions. Because you're going to have different groups on different bills. Somebody who might vote in favor of Medicaid expansion might not necessarily support, defunding the Pentagon per se. But, it's kind of one of those things where it's how do you get to a point where we're able to kind of get to a position where we're able to actually come together, where we're able to come to common ground and actually pass legislation. Because we're so factionalized on Republican versus Democrat that we forget that we actually have the opportunity to pass legislation by building coalitions, by actually building force and making sure that we can place that force on our elected officials. Because I've seen it happen in New Hampshire and I know that we can replicate it in Washington.
I want to talk about that actually. Um, Genuine opinion question I have for you then. What do you think is the current like dark horse faction that like hasn't been activated in the U.S. House in your
Yeah.
mind?
In the U.S. House, I think that the Republicans and the Libertarian caucuses, we're seeing it a little bit with Thomas Massie and kind of the fact that he's been willing to kind of slide with the Democrats a little bit, but it is something where there are more people in the US House that have similar positions and ideals to him. And it's how do we activate those people? How can we make sure that they come out? Because in New Hampshire, I've seen it, we have a large libertarian sect of our Republican caucus, and we can definitely activate that. It's how we can actually make sure that these people can come to the table. And it's a unique way that, looking at the dynamics rather than talking about the Democrats, but talking about the Republicans.
Is there anyone you won't work with?
Anyone that I
Yeah.
won't work with? That's a good question. It depends because I think that you have to be open to working with pretty much anybody, and that's really important. I think you got to keep your mind open, your ears open, and be willing to listen to what people have to say and where they might be
Mhm.
willing to work with you.
You know, you had mentioned earlier in one of your answers that it's important that we bring new leadership to the table and new members to the table so that we can put new ideas on the table and actually enable that sort of structural change. I want to ask you as a clarifying point. Do you think it's that we need new ideas, or do you think we just need to push harder for the ones that have already been said? Because Medicare for All has been a thing
Yeah.
forever. I mean, I was a freshman in college when the 2016 election happened. I mean, like I remember hearing about it back then. Do you think it's that we need a
Yeah.
new formulation of that idea or a new articulation of it, or what?
I mean, when we're talking about things like Medicare for all, I think that's a solid idea. That's one where we are, talking about it. That's not necessarily a new idea, like you said. But we're seeing problems like private equity firms purchasing up single family homes, where in the New Hampshire state legislature, we talk a ton about, building additional developments, making sure that we have investments coming into the state, but we never talk about who's buying it. And so when we are talking about these ideas, the halls of power aren't necessarily listening to, what is happening on the ground, and they're trying to solve a lot of these problems by just throwing more things into the equation rather than reassessing the equation as a whole, looking at where we could actually do better. And when I talking about private equity, this is something that we are seeing across the entirety of this country, where private equity firms are buying up large swaths of developments. They're buying up, a number of different properties. And then what do? They sell it back to themselves for higher and higher rates. And it jacks up all the costs. Rents go up, mortgages go up, every single cost goes up. And it's something where people like you and I, we're not able to compete with that. When they're slapping $100,000 on the table over asking price, that's not something that we can compete with. And that's where we have to have government intervention and say, hey, this is a market that should be for only, single families or individuals that are trying to purchase these homes, because that is who should be, ideally the consumer for these types of, things. And that's where we're not necessarily thinking about, who's buying it, but who's trying to produce it. And we need to change the mentality around that.
Well,
And
oh, good.
oh, yeah, but yeah, it's not just housing though. When we're talking about education as well. I mean, one of the things that I think that we talk about, a ton is tuition-free public universities, and something that needs to be pushed a lot more is free trade schools. Because I do think that when we're looking at how our economy is built out, we have a lot of problems. I mean, if you come to New England, in northern New England specifically, we have a huge problem with workforce retention. We have the highest in-state tuition anywhere in the country here at our state universities in New Hampshire. We're one of the only states that exports more than half of our high school grads to out-of-state universities. We have an extremely expensive housing market, as I had already mentioned. And yet, we constantly are pushing for better and better business taxes, and better options that benefit these large corporations rather than actually help the individuals. And that's where we need to think about how we can actually provide opportunities for these people where they can get the educational options that actually help make it easier for them to stay here. We have a lot of needs for uh, not just plumbers, electricians, carpenters, all the different trades. But we need to think about our nursing staff, our doctors, our emergency services that we're not necessarily able to keep funded. And that's where, when we're talking about how we can actually expand our economy to make it better, we need to be thinking about the workers. Because I mean, all the businesses, they already know New Hampshire's not the place to be. We're ranked 42nd in the country for business development. And that, I think, is a real factor, because people, they see that our workforce is leaving. They see that the housing is too expensive, and they see that the land is too expensive. So why would you invest in any infrastructure here? If you don't already have the infrastructure, you're not going to invest in it. If you don't have the workforce and you see that we actually just surpassed Maine as the oldest workforce in the country, why would you come here? Because people are going to retire and you're not going to be able to replace them. So we're seeing all these problems, like the Budweiser plant in Merrimack shutting down. That's losing 200 jobs. And it's just like, this doesn't make any sense to me as to why they're moving out of the state, because we're doing so much to try and keep them here, yet we're not able to keep the people who work there here. And that's the real problem. So
Hmm.
it's kind of multiple factors there, but and it's not just that, but it's AI as well, and
Yeah, yeah. Well,
the,
well, here's what I want to know then. So
yeah,
you're a lifelong New Hampshire resident, right?
yes.
I mean, so is it a chicken or the egg problem then, right? Like, do you think that it's that businesses were just sort of disincentivized from continuing to invest in New Hampshire as opposed to other states in New England, and so it just kind of like begat this sort of like underinvestment from them? Do you think it's like an undertaxation problem, so that way that like the state couldn't finance its own services well enough that would actually entice people to
Yeah.
stay? Is it that young people just like saw like the gleaming cities on the hill in Boston and New York and Philly, and we're like, well, I mean, like the best place I have to live is Concord versus like Philly or something, and it's like barely more
Yeah.
expensive, 20 years ago or something. Like what is it?
Yeah.
What beget what?
So I think it's a multiple different factors. I think that the housing costs going up is one of the big problems. The other aspect is the educational funding. I mean, in
Mm,
my community, where I grew up, my family, we moved here when I was like three. I've lived in my state house district my whole life. Moved from one town to another, and it at the time it was one of the best elementary schools, middle schools in the state. We don't have our own high school here in my town, but in terms of the schools that we did have, they were, when I was there, they actually were ranked number one in the state at one point. And today, they're in the bottom 25%. The problem
mm,
is in my community, we have only a couple businesses. Every single other place that revenue comes from is from local property taxes. The state for the past 30 years has been embattled in different legal fights around school funding. We have certain constitutional provisions that say that the state is supposed to fund 50% of all schools in the state. We maybe fund about 20% of their budgets if they're lucky.
mm,
The rest comes from local property taxes. And we have been downshifting costs and eliminating a lot of different revenue sources that we've had, which is really kind of compounding to a lot of the problems that we've seen. Because not only have we seen, revenue go down, I mean, drastically even this year because we got rid of our interest and dividends tax, but we're seeing problems from our K through 12 system where the educational opportunities have been kind of slipping there in a lot of ways. Um, and I mean, New Hampshire, I will say we do have some great schools, but it is local dependent and locality dependent because as I said, it comes down to the wealth in the different communities that are able to fund the schools. So we're kind of in a situation where some people move out because the options and the opportunities there are not as good as would be available in other places. And the university system is no different because the university system has been very much gutted in a lot of ways where I mean they just got rid of the journalism department this past year. They changed the name of it for whatever reason, and it's just like we're eliminating options in professions that people could go into that they are educated right here in New Hampshire for. And that I think is one of the big problems that we've seen because we have been competing with a few states for education funding
mm.
in terms of what our what we provide to our schools and how much that actually causes their local tuition to go up. I mean, we have, even if we tripled our in-state funding for our university systems, we'd still be dead last, if I'm not mistaken, or we would just be barely 49th. Uh,
Mm.
and so we
Yeah.
have all these problems because we aren't investing in the programs that we need. We're not investing in the infrastructure that's going to make our state better going forward. And that has led to a lot of problems. I think that,
Yeah.
those few things are part of the reasons why, New Hampshire is in part of the, part of the problem that we're in. And, being the oldest state in the country now, it is something where we are driving young people away because the jobs are not here. The housing is too expensive. The cost of living is too high. And, we just had wages go up in a number of different states. I mean, hell, Connecticut just raised theirs to, just over $16 an hour. Every other state in New England is pretty much, I believe, over $14 an hour, except for
Hmm.
New Hampshire, which is 7.25. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so it's all these problems where people can't get ahead. The cost of living is still super expensive because you're in that New England metro area. And in the Boston metro area, I should say. And, that's where people want to be in a lot of ways. And so the cost of housing has been, driven up. The cost of education is so high that they go elsewhere. They go down to Massachusetts or Maine or Vermont or, elsewhere outside of New England even. And that's where we need to, try and retain those people. That's where we need to provide trade school opportunities so that people can get their apprenticeships. They can go into the different fields that are not necessarily going to be pushed out by AI. Because when you have a plumbing issue, I'm sorry, but you could ask Grok, you can ask ChatGPT, you can ask whoever. They're not going to be able to fix that for you. You're going to need somebody to come in and actually do the dirty work. And those AI-proof jobs, I think, are really important, and we need to be talking about those a lot more.
So as like a freshman, as a freshman congressperson, if you were to be elected, and knowing that you are so focused on like coalition building in order to get like big wins, and hearing what you've said about the state of New Hampshire, I mean, these sound like generational issues, right? I mean, like these sound like that they're longstanding in their causes and they'll be longstanding in their effects. But every single congressperson's term is the same. It's 2 years, right?
Yes.
And so I imagine it's a very hard sell to make to a voter in your district to say, you vote for me, within 2 years, you'll see enough inertia to trust that the change is going to come. And so to that, with that fact being the case, I must ask, like, what would you want to tackle first then? Like, what would be the win that you would most want to see done by the time that your 2 years is up, by the time that the next midterms come around, like, in order
Yeah.
to make that case to a voter?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I first it's getting through the Trump years. That's really what we need to be thinking about first, I think. But part of the sell and what we're talking about in this primary is what happens after Trump, and that is where talking about things like Medicare for all, I think that is the number one priority that I have on my list, because even though, as we talked about, it might not necessarily be a new idea, it's one that we desperately need, and it's one where people are struggling. I mean, the whole reason I got involved in politics, I suffered an L4 burst fracture when I was 15. I suffered a severe spinal injury, and I had to have my spinal cord rebundled. I had 4 rods, 8 screws put in. I remember that I was and I'm very thankful that I wasn't paralyzed, but I remember learning how to walk again and how difficult that was. And it's just like all of those things that you're worrying about while you're recovering are just part of the problem, when then you also have to worry about insurance and the cost of being hospitalized on top of all that. It's very difficult to be able to justify the system that we have right now in the continuation of it, because the exploitation of people is just far too rampant, and we need to do what we can to make sure that people are protected. And I think that this is one way that we can do that.
I want to talk about your stance on healthcare here, because I obviously have done quite a lot of reading about you leading up to this, and I've read about how you have said that your own injury gave you a firsthand look at the bureaucratic violence, I believe is the word you used one time,
Yeah.
of the medical insurance industry. And I'm curious your opinion. When you look at somebody like Stephanie Shaheen, right, who just like
Yep.
advocates for improving the Affordable Care Act, and the whole legion of Democrats who, for the last 15 years now, have basically said like, it's just about making Obamacare better. Maybe we can get some Medicaid expansion. This, that, the other. Do you think it's their own lack of like firsthand experience with how bad the health insurance system is, or the healthcare system in America is, that lets them advocate for that being the zenith of what American like politics can do for healthcare? Or do you think there's something deeper there? Like, what do you think is the delta really that is making it so that somebody like Shaheen says ACA improvements are the best, are what we should shoot for, versus somebody like you
Yeah.
says, no, we need universal healthcare now?
Yeah, we need universal healthcare now, and I think that we can look at different countries and how they've implemented their own universal healthcare systems. Because again, this is a UN requirement. We are actually violating international law by not having a universal healthcare system. And Australia actually, they went through a process where they had a universal healthcare system, and they rolled that back into a tiered system. And, we basically have what is effectively worse than a tiered public system where you can, have a public level and then you can pay to have a public plus or whatever, additional coverage. And it is a situation where people ended up having longer wait times after the implementation of this tiered system, and how that was actually a negative in how the universal healthcare system was working. Because some people could pay to get that, priority service, but that means that you're throwing everybody else under the bus. That means that you're throwing the people who might not necessarily have the money to be able to pay for those extra services, just like what we have now. It's like, yeah, if you get hit by a car, they'll bring you to the hospital, they'll fix you right up, but you're still going to have to pay for it. And it's just like there are still, issues with the way that they are going about things. Because if you have cancer, you might not necessarily be prioritized in that type of system. And that's where we have to think about everybody equally. That's where we have to think about how we can provide equal care to everyone. And that's where a universal healthcare system and, getting, away from this ACA style, subsidy of a private insurer is just, and beyond that, and also having just a generalized public option. We have to have more than that. We have to have a single tier universal system that advocates for everyone, regardless of how much money you make, regardless of how old you are, regardless of, what personal factors you're facing. You should be provided equal care and adequate care regardless of who you are. And I think that that is really important. And it's something where if you haven't dealt with the difficulties of insurance, if you haven't dealt with how aggravating it can be to spend hours on the phone with some of these people just to get, the modicum of respect that we should be provided in basic, that I think is really important. And I don't really think that a few of these people who are, running for office are, like, Stephanie Shaheen really understand the impact of that. I mean, they've never had to worry about, going to the doctor. They've never had to worry about if they got injured or sick. They've never had to worry about that. And advocating for just an ACA, subsidy or an increase in the subsidy is nowhere near what we need to be doing, because all it does is enrich the CEOs and the C-suite executives that are a part of all of those insurers. And it's a problem where they are getting huge checks and bonuses for cutting our care, and I don't think that that's acceptable. I think that we need to advocate for a system that benefits the public and everyone regardless.
Now, here's my question, right? So there's a I think a growing contingent of progressive voters who are starting to look at the lack of progress that has been made over the last 15 years in healthcare in the United States, healthcare policy. And I think that they are now beginning to start saying it's Medicare for all or bust. Don't go in there swinging for ACA subsidy expansion or any of that, right?
Yeah.
We need something way past that. My question to you is, knowing that you do want to try and form those powerful coalitions possible, right? If you come face to face with the libertarians in Congress, or let's say the neocons in Congress, and they'll say, listen, Heath, sure, we want the voters off our back, whatever, we'll give you a public option. We're not swinging for universal health care, take our vote or leave it. What do you say in that regard?
In that regard, I mean, it's kind of one of those things where we have to take, it depends on what the makeup of the House is at the time. Because I mean, again, we can predict, and I mean, it's kind of one of those things where it's an iffy issue, because some of me says you got to take the little incremental wins where you can, but some of me also says, we could do better and we could take another crack at the apple. It depends on what the makeup is, and it depends on what we actually have, for momentum. And I think that we have to look at the situation as it comes to the table, and I hope that we can get a universal system passed that goes beyond a tiered system. But that is one where it depends, I think, on what the actual makeup is in the legislature.
What do you think is going to be the makeup by the time the midterms are up? Because I mean, it
Yeah,
depends on who you ask, but like there does seem to be a
yeah,
consensus that is forming that like Republicans are about to get wiped. So what do you
yeah.
think though, as somebody who's actually on the ground?
Yes. I mean, I think that it's going to be dependent because it's not just what happens in the Democrat versus Republican elections. It depends on what happens in the Democratic primaries. And that I think is really key to understanding what's going to happen and what's going to be possible because there are some Democrats that are crazy enough to say that they're anti-Medicare for all. And I think that, we need to make sure that they're not necessarily needed to make sure that those pass. I think that we need to, do what we can to make sure that we elect people across the board in primaries across the country that are going to be pro Medicare for all. And when we have that Democratic majority, then we need to enact on it.
I actually want to talk about primaries and disruption
Mhm.
because I think you know what I'm about to bring up, which is that fateful dinner, and you given the business to Shaheen. I don't know if my audience is going to know about
Yeah.
that, but I'd like you to tell that story and explain why it is that you disrupted her and what the nature of your comments was supposed to reveal about how you feel about the state of
Yeah.
healthcare in the United States versus how maybe she does.
Yeah. So, I mean, I ended up heckling Senator Shaheen at our one of our annual fundraisers that the NHDP throws on, the Eleanor Roosevelt dinner. And I called her out because during her speech, I just grew angry and I grew more and more angry hearing what she had to say because she first brought up the vote earlier in her speech and kind of danced around it. But I couldn't let it go when she said that nobody had done more for for healthcare in the ACA than her and Senator Hassan. Because I felt in that moment, especially their votes, it was not it was not true. You can't say that them voting with the Republicans on a handshake agreement to gut the ACA was anything but a vote against the ACA itself. And I believe that her colleagues in the Senate who voted against that proposition to reopen the government uh, did protect the ACA and did far more than Senator Shaheen. I felt very betrayed. I had, a number of people who I know had been in contact with Senator Shaheen's office, friends of mine in the disability community, who Senator Shaheen had used for social media posts as to why she was holding strong on the government shutdown to begin with. People who are going to struggle, and I worry about, and I hope are able to survive 2026 because of those votes. And it's just like you look at some of the people that and it's like you can't say that this is anything but personal. Because, I mean, for me, I know so many people that are going to lose their health care.
Mhm.
And it's like you look at the situation that we're in, and it's like this is so avoidable.
Yeah.
And I can't say that the Democratic Party is doing enough to protect the healthcare of Americans, in that we need people who are going to advocate for Medicare for all if we're going to actually make that change. Because it's embarrassing to me to say that this is the type of leadership that we have because we can do so much better. And I think that what we had was a piece of leverage that we just gave away.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that was a smart decision. I don't think that was a smart move. And I think that it is inadvertently going to cost the lives of, my friends. And it's very troubling. And as I said,
For
I
sure.
can't I can't take it anything but personally.
Oh, of course. Of course. Knowing that politics is personal. and every single decision that is made by a politician, right, is personally made against or for their constituents. That's my opinion anyway.
Mhm.
And knowing that, I do wonder, are there any members of Congress right now that you look at with any admiration for how they've conducted themselves in the last year? Is there anybody who you are taking the lead of, or who you look at and you're I need to make
Yep.
allies with them if I get in the chair?
Yeah. I would say Ro Khanna has done a very good job of getting himself out there and pushing the issues, talking about the Epstein files, going and working across the aisle, as I had mentioned earlier with Thomas Massey. I think that that was really important. And helping get the ball moving on a number of these things. I think that AOC and a lot of the work that she's done. I mean, I have a lot of respect for her. And I mean, in the Senate, I want to work with Senator Sanders, of course, and everything that he's been able to do. And I'm looking at some of the other Senate races around the country, and I'm optimistic about some of the people. I'm looking at races like Minnesota and Peggy Flanagan, and what she's building over there and whatnot, and some of the other races that are happening around the country. I mean, it's really inspirational, and I think that we're going to need those people to win these primaries where it's very clear that we have a progressive running, and we need to make sure that people support them.
Absolutely. Now, I do want to acknowledge that you've definitely been able to win some tough fights. There's not a question in my mind about that. Um, Correct me if I'm wrong though. Your election to the state house last year, it was decided by like 16 votes. Am I correct about that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Now, obviously, that is like a razor thin margin in a district that is carried by a Republican governor. I want to know though, like, what did that close call like teach you about the electorate that you are now trying to command? Like, when you're trying to scale from a few
Yeah.
thousand voters in Stratford to a congressional district that has like hundreds of thousands of people, right? How do you expand that coalition without diluting the progressive message
Yeah.
that you and I both agree is paramount right now?
Yeah, it's how you talk to the voters. I mean, I've got, support from Democrats, Republicans, independents, people who are politically disillusioned. I mean, in the last poll that we had come out, I'm the only candidate receiving support from people who did not vote in 2024. About
Mm.
60% of the entire electorate is undecided. About 60% of those who didn't vote in 2024 is undecided. But the other 40%, they're all in Team Heath. And I think that really kind of says a message as to what we're able to build because, I mean, so often, we think about, elections in a very small way where it's a very small universe. We know who the voters are, we know who's going to come out and support them. And that's something that Trump shattered in 2016. What happened? A bunch of people who never voted before came out. And it's like, yes, all the polls said that Hillary would win, all the polls said that. And it's just like, what happened? People who were not being polled, people who were not necessarily seen as potential voters came out and said, I'm voting for Trump. And that is something that, we need to take into consideration is the fact that we have a lot of voters that are disillusioned. Why did Trump win in 2024 and why did Kamala lose? It's not because Trump was able to pull additional voters into his camp. It's because people didn't show up. We know this. If people came out to the polls, if there were different policies that were effectuated, if there was a harder line stance taken on Gaza per se, that I think was one of the issues that cost Kamala Harris this past election. And we need to be a lot more vocal about that because there are voters that we can gain and we can get out to come and vote for us if we actually talk about the issues that they care about. And that's something that I've been able to accomplish in Stratford in my district because it is very difficult to get some of these people to kind of break away from their straight ticket voting,
Yeah.
and that is something where I have had a lot of success with that. I've been able to communicate with people. I show up and, talk with them, and, I'm able to actually explain my positions and provide them reasons as to why I'm doing things the way that I'm doing them. And I think that, part of what we are doing right now is, looking at Democrat, Republican, and putting ourselves into those factions automatically, rather than trying to include people. I mean, I had a party for New Year's the other evening, and I had a guy wearing a "Make America Christian Again" shirt come up, and he showed up to the party, and he's like, "Heath, I know that we are not the same political party, but I've looked at all the candidates, and I believe that you're the one for me." He's looked at all the Republicans, looked at all the Democrats, and said, you're the one for me. You're the one who's putting America first. Which, I mean, it's like, well, if that's the way that you want to put it, I've got my own way of putting it. But, I mean, again, we need to be putting people first, and I think that, we need to be providing respect for individuals across not just our country, but across the globe. And, I think that that's where, we need to be, advocating for the needs of the American people, universal health care, an education system that actually works for them, affordable housing that isn't dominated by private equity or large corporations, a livable wage. And, actually talking about those issues in a way where we can actually move our country forward. Because I think that, we have a lot that there is in common between, just individuals. And we so often, exclude people rather than try and bring them into our coalition.
Is there anything surprising that you're finding as you talk to people who are Republicans and
Yeah.
Democrats and independents? Like, is there anything surprising that
Yep.
you're finding that, like, just across the board, they all agree with, even if they would never think that the other agrees with them?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, the housing issues are ones that people really agree with because, I mean, they don't like the fact that the private equity firms are rigging the game, and they see it as a real problem. And that's the largest issue here in New Hampshire. 36% of voters have said time and time again that housing is the number one problem here in the state. And we need to have real solutions. And, that's something where we have a very clear problem, and one that we're not necessarily addressing it holistically. We're talking about just the developers, and that's where we need to talk about, who's buying it up. And I think that people are more amenable to that than across the political spectrum than one would expect.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I want to do with you what I've done with everybody, which is as we
Mhm.
end our time together, I want to actually look forward and imagine you in 2036 or 2037, I guess, is when it would be the 10-year anniversary of you being sworn in. Imagine that you had served 5 terms in Congress, right? And what I want you to do with us now is I want you to, without using policy names, right, try to
Mhm.
make it as visceral as possible. I want you to try and describe the life of a 10-year-old child that has been born today in somewhere like Manchester or Dover, but
Yep.
now they're 10 years old, right? So if you've been successful
Yep.
as a congressperson, like what is actually tangibly different about like that child's life compared to the path that they are on right now?
Yeah. They would have grown up in an affordable child care center where they are able to actually, go and be able to, be in an affordable place rather than looking at a child care option that's more expensive than college. The fact that we have schools that are actually funded to the proper level, and that we have, trade schools that are being promoted, and that we're expanding things like Job Corps. I was very disgusted to see, how that's been gutted recently. The fact that, we need to expand opportunities for this child where, when I'm talking about trade schools, we need to be looking at different vocational options that they might have the option to go into for high school. The fact that this child should not necessarily have to worry about whether their parent is going to make their rent payment, making sure that we have affordable mortgages, making sure that we aren't necessarily pushing for 50-year mortgages, I should say. But there are a number of things that I think that a child's life could be improved by. And that would include, I think, not just education, not just childcare, not just stable housing, but affordability across the board, making sure that we actually are able to look at, how expensive it is to have a child in this day and age, and making sure that we can actually lower the cost of all the needs that a parent has, I think is really important. And that's something that we should be able to work on, I think, across the political spectrum. And this is where, Democrats and Republicans, I think, can really come together and really kind of uplift families by, making sure that we can provide the necessary needs that that child has, making sure that they're fed, making sure that they're educated, making sure that they have a place to sleep, making sure that they have all the educational opportunities ahead of them so that they can actually have a better life. Because when we look at places like China and the reason why their society is so happy. It's because the generation of today is better off than the generation of yesterday. And it's the fact that they are seeing how their kids and those kids, they're better off than their parents. And those parents are better off than their grandparents. And it's the fact that we are not necessarily seeing that same type of development here in the United States. And we need to change that. We need to kind of move towards a system where we are able to provide tangible reason as to say, hey, we are better off now than we were when I was a kid. We're better off now when I was a kid than we were when my parents were kids, and so on and so on, because that is ideally what we can actually say would provide real benefit to the populace.
Absolutely. Representative Heath Howard, thank you so much for joining us today here on this episode of Corncast. Okay, I want to be real with you. You and I probably both tuned into this interview expecting a sort of standard issue progressive like venting session about the system at large. And we kind of got that, but we also like mostly didn't get that. What we got instead was a 25-year-old socialist who was saying that his like dream collaborator in Congress would be like the libertarian Thomas Massey. And I think we should pause on that because it's interesting. Because I think there's plenty of people who maybe heard this interview and heard, Representative Howard say that he wants to work with people in like the Freedom Caucus, for example, and thought, well, I mean, if it gets like things like a universal healthcare system passed, who gives a shit? And I can understand that because, like this is the same guy who heckled a Democratic senator, not necessarily out of malice either, just because like he literally feels personally betrayed by her, and he's talking about working with the Freedom Caucus to dismantle the corporate state. And I think that when I hear stuff like that, it tells me that I was wrong about who I thought Representative Howard was, because I kind of expected him to be more of like a protest vote sort of candidate. But he just has a completely different theory of power, I think. I don't think that Representative Howard is running to be like the next member of the squad. I think instead he's running to be sort of like a mechanic for a broken machine. He talks in this interview about banning private equity from buying a starter home so a young couple can't have it. He talks in this interview about comparing American misery to generational Chinese progress. These lines, he says that 100% will get him in trouble with like the superiors in the Democratic Party. But I mean, I think more than anything, when he says stuff like that, he's talking to the audience and he's forcing you to ask yourself, like, is he wrong? And I think most people listening to this are going to say, no, he's not wrong. And I think that if Representative Howard loses, which I would certainly hate to see it happen, then I think that the New Hampshire machine itself just keeps humming. The status quo wins again, whatever. But I think that if he wins, I think that the game changes just a little bit more. And I mean, yes, we would get a new congressman. Sure, that'd be great. But we would also prove that broke, radical young people who, mind you, if he wins, his peers in Congress absolutely will just call him a kid because they love doing that shit. But we would prove that broke, radical young people who know what the system actually wrings out of everybody can potentially break the gridlock by blowing up traditional alliances that the party machines take for granted and actually need to stay calcified. Now, whether or not that potentially terrifies you or thrills you is only a question you can answer. But I know one thing for sure, which is that I thank Representative Howard for coming on to Corncast, and I thank all of you for watching, as always.